Okay, welcome to week 4 in our class on Hosea. I'm really finishing up the chapters that I had set aside. I won't go back to the itinerary, but last week I was supposed to finish chapter 2 and chapter 3, but I didn't get done. I got done with chapter 2, but didn't get into chapter 3 because I really wanted to settle in a little bit and discuss a couple of things that I had sort of mentioned in passing and hadn't really gotten into much detail on. So I wanted to do that for you guys tonight. And the first issue is this issue on Baalism. We spoke of Baalism. We spoke of the issue of the northern kingdom and the idolatry that had taken place there. And what was that idolatry? It was a worship of Baal, but it was more the syncretistic way in which they did it with Yahweh. Remember Jeroboam, and who brought that up? Tom, or can't remember if that was Tom or Dan. Somebody brought up Jeroboam earlier this evening, and what did Jeroboam do? What happened there in the northern kingdom? Yeah, he set up a couple of places of worship, right?
He built a whole society around it.
He built a whole society around it, and he had his main place, but it was to attract the people there to those places of worship in the northern kingdom so that they would not return to the true worship which was to occur in Jerusalem. And how did he do that? Well, he created a god. He created a golden bowl and said, just as Aaron did when they came out of the land of Egypt, that this is your God who has delivered you. Come here and worship him. So there was a sense in which Yahweh was involved in their worship. He attributed this, at least initially, to Yahweh. But on top of Yahweh, there was set up Asherah poles. What is Asherah? What is an Asherah pole? What is it? Yeah, Asherah was a fertility goddess that went along with Baal worship. So wherever you found Baal worship, you would also find Asherah poles. And it was really a large phallic symbol that the population would rally around. And it was often associated with cult prostitution and things of that nature. Well, all of that was mixed in with this worship of Yahweh that supposedly Jeroboam had set up. So you had a syncretism going on in the worship, a mixture. The worship was not pure. It was not holy to God. There were too many other things going on there that were abhorrent to the Lord. And what happens is as a religious people, remember, I'm going back now to the book of Amos, they felt that their worship was acceptable to God because, hey, we're worshiping Yahweh. Yahweh's included in this, all of this that they were doing. But what did God say to the nation? Even in the book of Amos, and we're going to see more of it in Hosea as well. What did God say to them? He said, I abhor your worship. And he warned them of the punishment that was to come on account of their idolatry. But what did Israel do in that warning that Amos gave them? Nothing. They were very content in their worship. They were very content in their prosperity. They were very content in their might, their strength. They felt that these things would keep the bad guys out there, the Assyrians especially at the time, at bay, and they really had nothing to worry about. They were very prosperous. Everything was fine. Why should we worry about what Amos has to say? In fact, Amos, why don't you go go back to the southern kingdom. That's where you came from. Go back there and spend your time back there. We don't need you up here, right? So now Hosea comes on the scene, and Hosea is demonstrating their unfaithfulness through this marriage that he has with his wife Gomer. And this was not something that he probably, I would assume, do on his own, but it was something that God commanded him to do as a picture of Israel's unfaithfulness to the Lord. And we're coming up on chapter 3, and that's why I felt we needed to talk about these things here, because some important stuff happens here in chapter 3 that's really sort of a turning point in the book of Hosea. And it's a short chapter, but we really need to figure some things out here before we enter into that chapter. Now, fortunately for me, Tom did a lot of that figuring out. So you guys are way ahead of the ball game here, but I'm going to present what I have, very similar to what Tom had. I have different verses and things like that, but it all leads to the same conclusion. So I'll show you guys that tonight, so you'll get a little bit of a double dose of the issue of marriage and divorce. But first we want to talk about the unfaithfulness, the idolatry of Israel, which is what Gomer represented in her unfaithfulness. Her adultery represented the northern kingdom's adultery or idolatry that they committed, and a lot of that had to do with Baalism. So I mentioned an article last week, and it turns out, as I'm searching for this article, I go home and say, okay, let me find this. I'm going to make copies and all this. Well, it turns out it's already in your book, okay? So I wasted a lot of time, looking for this. But it's on page 138, okay? There it is. Baalism and Yahwism updated. Now, we're gonna go through that. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. It's kind of lengthy, but I certainly encourage you to. But I also want to introduce it with some other things on Baal worship that I found, and I just want to mention these. Okay, the first article I found is by a gentleman named Scott Clark, and he wrote this about a decade ago. And he says this, and he talks about a James Ord who summarized a passage from Eugene Peterson. Well, Eugene Peterson is the gentleman who wrote this article in your booklet called Baalism and Yahwism Updated, which happened to be very lengthy. I actually went to buy this online just to see the whole thing, and it cost $37. You have to sign up for a subscription to what was it? Wasn't Christianity Today, but it was a similar type of Christian magazine type of thing. But they have rights to Eugene Peterson's article, which is really a small book. We just have an excerpt of it here in our booklet. So I didn't buy the whole thing, but this gives us what we need for tonight. So he says this, that he says, Peterson points out, and you're going to see this as when we go through it, that experience-driven worship was the hallmark of Baalism, the religion of the Canaanites in the Old Testament era. Their entire worship structure was focused on catering to emotions. Okay, so as we hear this about Baalism, just think about today. When you were terror-stricken, what did you do? You went and you offered a sacrifice. When you were anxious about the crops, what would you do? You would go and visit the temple prostitute. When you were joyful, what would you do? You would go ingest the wine god. Okay, so remember, again, going back to Amos, we talked about all of these forms of Baal worship. they had many gods, and they all involved different aspects or attributes of Baal. And so that's what he's talking about here. So he says in his book, Peterson warns about against what he calls neo-Baalism, a contemporary revival of the mindset of ancient Baalism. Neo-Baalism complains when we don't get anything out of worship. Okay, so what he's talking about is our contemporary church today. What do you hear from those who are, say, seeking out a church? They'll come in and they'll look at something. They might see me up front trying to belt out a tune, and what are they thinking? This neo-Baalistic approach is that, well, we didn't really get anything out of that worship. Okay? In other words, it's very existential in its approach. It's about, what do I feel? What do I experience? Okay? And that is characteristic of Baalism. So I'm kind of introducing you to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about Baalism here as we go, and then we'll look at this article just so you guys have a good feel for how all of this fits together, because what is happening in the church today is what the Northern Kingdom did. Now, we might look at what the Northern Kingdom did and say, oh my gosh, we would never do that in a church today. But we are doing very similar things, okay? And so I just want us to see those parallels. So he goes on and says, Neo-Baalism is all about the experience, regardless of content. We may be entertained, warmed, diverted, or excited in such worship. We will probably not be changed, and we will certainly not be saved through it. Okay? That might be a bit of a harsh statement, and I only say that because I think that God saves through His Word. If His Word is being sung in a song, no matter how existential that song may have meant to be, if they're up there playing drums and electric guitars and all this other stuff, that might, if God prepares someone's heart, that even that could save them. So this might be a bit of a harsh statement, but I understand where he's going. Let's see. Okay, and then he goes on and he talks about contrasting Baalism with the Heidelberg Catechism. Okay, so what does a Heidelberg Catechism say? Well, in one part it says, what does God require in the second commandment? Okay, that we in no wise make any image of God, nor worship Him in any other way that He has commanded us in His Word. That is it in a nutshell. That's the Heidelberg Confession or Catechism, and that's exactly what he says the modern church is doing today. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the Northern Kingdom and some of the stuff you've heard from me, but some of this stuff is a little new perspective. So this is another article here, and it starts out this way. It says, the Northern Kingdom of Israel had reason to be feeling very pleased with themselves. Okay, the trolls from the trade routes which passed through the territory were adding tolls, not trolls, tolls from the trade routes which passed through their territory were adding to their wealth. The weather on the whole was being kind to them, resulting in good harvests. The result was that many people, especially the upper classes, were growing very wealthy, although, as it is often, it was at the expense of others. And we saw that as we went through Amos. As a consequence of their prosperity, they no doubt considered that the syncretistic religion that Jeroboam had established at Bethel and Dan, okay, and I don't want to go back and look at that, I think we're all familiar with that, had more than justified itself. Okay, so in other words, they have this syncretistic religion. They're practicing it. The people are flocking by the thousands to Bethel and Dan to participate in this worship, and their nation is doing very well. It's very prosperous. So what is the natural inclination of the people? It's to think that, well, we'll keep doing what we're doing because it's working. You know, we're doing very well here, you know, in our little newly found country here. So it goes on. How could all this prosperity possibly have happened if Yahweh and the other gods who they worship there were not pleased with them? Okay, Yahweh, of course, is this covenant God that they were commanded to set before them as their God. He goes on, he says, unfortunately, however, there's also a bad side to all this that they failed to see, as he says we often do, the practical ways in which their lives were far from pleasing to God. Due to the fact that the debased Yahwism, okay, so Yahwism in this context is that true Yahweh worship which Israel was to partake in. The Yahwism introduced by Jeroboam had tended to override the covenant that they had made and became mingled with Baalism. Their worship had become degraded, impure, syncretistic, and Yahweh was seen as just another one of their gods, a nature god specifically, and the laws of Yahweh were being ignored, and this in spite of the fact that he had proven himself by redeeming them from Egypt and giving them the land of the Amorites, the Canaanites, etc. And we saw that as one of the arguments that we saw in Hosea chapter 2, is that God said, it is I, not any of these other gods. I delivered you from Egypt and gave you this land. Okay, and he chose them as his people. Okay, so it says the old laws that had ensured that families retain their own tracts of family land. Okay, so remember the laws in 1 Kings where the people, it started in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but it went in 1 Kings, they're reminded of it, and they're also showing as having set it aside. And what that had to do with was the year of Jubilee, where you could sell your land, but that land was always to be yours. That land was always to be retained within the families, within the tribes. So if you had a plot of land and you found yourself in debt, you could sell that land to who you were indebted to, and they would buy it for a price, but that price was based on how many years were left until the year of Jubilee. So if the year of Jubilee was next year, they probably wouldn't pay a whole lot for it. You might have to sell larger swaths of land in order to pay off your debt, because it was only going to remain with them. They could only use the land for a year. Whereas if there were another 40 years till then, you could get a really good price for even a smaller piece of land, but that land always reverted back to you, back to your family, back to your tribe. All of those things in the northern kingdom were set aside and ignored, and the rich had taken advantage of this and so owned much of the land in the north, whereas those who were poor and couldn't afford it would basically lose their land. So as far as tribal allocations were concerned, that went away in the northern kingdom. It all became privatized. All right. I'm not going to read the rest of the article, but he talks about their prosperity and some of the things that it led to in their personal lifestyles. Okay, but I do want to talk about an article by a gentleman named Scott Brown, who is the pastor of a church called Hope Baptist Church in North Carolina, and he wrote, I thought, a very interesting article, and he entitled it Modern Baal Worship in Theaters, Stadiums, and Living Rooms. Okay, He says, so what was Baal worship and why was it so popular? He says it's a mistake to think of Baal worship as some kind of otherworldly practice that never happens today. On the contrary, he says it happens all the time in the form of cultural variations of the same general pattern that we saw in 2 Kings chapter 17 and chapter 21. And we won't look at that. But he'll talk about it here in just a second. In fact, Joan was talking about it somewhat here earlier. So regarding Baal worship, he says this, that we know that there were usually a lot of people gathered, often on a high hill like a theater or stadium, to observe things like public sex, just like we see in movies, television, or wherever. He says we think of our watching these things in the movies are different than the idolatry of old, but he says that's not the case. So what he's doing is he's making the case that some of the things that we do in everyday life, we may be also committing idolatry, just as the northern kingdom was doing. He says the whole community came out, and all of the best pagan ideas for success and crops and fertility, all these things were promoted, just like a business seminar that promotes unbiblical ideas that justify the worldliness of its origin. He says these wicked personalities who promote these things were very respected, and they were given a platform. And, again, he compares this platform to the platform that many celebrities, stars, even politicians have today as they promote these ungodly things. He goes on and says, in our day, people who go to our churches celebrate church celebrities when they should be doing the opposite. So you wonder why our music is so boring, okay? I'm just teasing you. I happen to not think it's boring. I love the hymns, okay? I had to, and when you coach a bunch of high school kids, music is a big deal for high school kids, right? So they always, I allow them to put music on when we're doing shooting drills and stuff like that in the gym sometimes, and they love that. And they put on this stuff, and they're dancing while they're shooting, and singing, and I don't know what's being said. They know that certain things can't be played on there, and they know that, and they do a really good job keeping clean stuff on there. But sometimes they want to please coach, and so they say, "Hey, coach, what do you want to listen to?" They're like, I got this, I don't know, the music apps. Pandora, is that one of them? I got like Pandora or whatever. What genre you like? I said, well, I kind of like the hymns. I said I like other stuff too, but I said I think the hymns is where I go first. And they were like, hymns, like church hymns? Well, yeah. And even those who are professing believers amongst these high school kids, they're like, church hymns. Well, coach, there are Christian groups that are really good out there, and they want to listen to other Christian music, which a lot of the stuff they play is that contemporary Christian music. But we'll never play that kind of stuff here in this church, at least as long as, I'm involved in the music program, because those things are not, we don't come to church to be stimulated by bands and this great music and guitar solos and all of this other stuff they have. Christian music today, contemporary Christian music, is made to emulate secular music. It's like, so I had a guy tell me once, he said, well, because I had told him, well, I don't listen to contemporary Christian music, I said, I just don't. I don't care for it, and I'm not sure that it's biblical. And he said, well, he goes, he goes, well, what do you listen to? Well, hymns. Well, he didn't really care about that. Do you listen to? Yeah, I listen to some classic rock, and I'll listen to some jazz stuff. I like big band stuff, Sinatra. And he goes, well, if you and he started equating a Christian group, like if you like, I used to like Bruce Springsteen. I don't care for the guy anymore, but I used to like Bruce Springsteen when I was young. And he said, well, if you like Springsteen, then you'll like, this Christian singer. So he would start equating the Christian songs because their music sounded like the secular music. Oh, you like, I don't know, the Beatles. Well, this Christian group over here, their music is just like the Beatles, and you hear it, and it's like, well, kind of sounds like they're trying to imitate the Beatles or whatever, but I never thought it was as good. But the point is that they're trying to emulate the secular world, the secular music, and all that comes with it. The hymns, however, in my opinion, are much different. When you look at the hymns, there's a theological content to them that when you sing them, and to me, some of those songs I just got to belt out, and I'm probably not hitting the keys. I rely on Joan and Cheryl for that. But I love the words. I just love what's going on in the hymn. And it means a lot, I'll get all stirred up there singing a particular hymn or some of the classic Christian songs, like when we listened to Handel over last Christmas and stuff like that, because of the content. It's the content of the song. It's the things that are being spoken that raise up the name of God to such an extent that I mean, it's thrilling. I don't get that in contemporary Christian music, and you'll hear that on the radio. You'll hear the contemporary Christian music when you turn to those Christian stations. Some of them play hymns sometimes, but then when you have it on after church or something, it's like, oh, they're done with their hymns. They got on something else, and it's usually, in my opinion, very repetitive, weak. I just can't hardly listen to it, What's that? Worldly, I think I'm always reminded of what Roger said about music in churches, and he started talking about it one time because he visited the church that Cheryl and I used to go to, called Fellowship Bible Church. Some of you guys are probably familiar with that church because it's still here, it's still around up on North Nevada now. It used to be downtown here. And they always had these contemporary singers up there and a little bit of music on the side and, stuff like this, but it was highly repetitive. And what Roger would say is, you listen to that stuff at Fellowship Bible, he said it alters your mind. It's designed to bring you from and these are Roger's expressions, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but frontal lobe thinking to mid-lobe or midbrain thinking, which is a little bit more ethereal. I might have that backwards. Maybe it's the other way around. I can't remember. But it's designed to change the way you think so that you start getting into this, very subjective, ethereal, feeling. And so when they start talking about the message, you get wrapped up in it. Oh gosh, that message was so good. It felt just wonderful, how he expressed this or that or whatever. Well, the music is a part of that, and it's designed to alter your mind, to get you to start thinking that way. And you would see people in churches, their eyes and they're swaying, and that's not what worship is all about, folks. Feeding the beast. Right, it's exactly what's happening. That's Baalism, okay? That's Baalism that has infiltrated the church. And it's not just the music. So we were in church one day at Fellowship Bible, Cheryl and I, and they had dancers. Well, what is this? They come out at the front of the church, and all these ladies in dresses, and they're dancing, doing I don't know what kind of dance it was. It was, to me, it was bizarre. It's like, okay, that's different. But I think the Lord had protected me to an extent, even while I was going there. But I was too young and kind of dumb in the Lord, and it was Roger who was like, dude, you got to get out of there. I started coming to the Bible Institute while we were going to Fellowship Bible at the same time, and he's just like, it's gonna do so much spiritual damage. And he kept telling me that, and he would tell me, well, this is what you're gonna hear. This is what you're gonna, this is what they're gonna say. And sure enough, they would, and it was so weak. And finally, I had to, Cheryl and I had to stop going there. But anyway, what happens in Baal music? He says people danced around the Asherah pole, okay? And he mentions that this obviously is nothing more than a phallic symbol. He said it's quite possible that these Asherah poles function very similarly to what the poles that he says you see in gentlemen's clubs are today. So pole dancing has become a big thing, and like it's become mainstream. It's like you see it in exercise programs. You see it in kids programs. They do it in gym class because there is strength building that you can do as you're climbing the pole and hanging on it and doing whatever you do on it. It's all done. It's very, very similar to yoga, right? It's all done in a non-religious environment, but the essence of it, the origins of it are very religious in nature. And so his advice, without going through all of this article, is, you stay away from that stuff, just like we would stay away from yoga. That's not something to be trifled with. He equates it to the Asherah pole and Baal worship. I talked about the crowds that assembled there, and you can see examples of that in 1st and 2nd Kings. He says the children, is really come out the losers in all this worship, including in the northern kingdom of Israel. He said, as many of them were actually sacrificed on this altar. To participate in the worship and the child sacrifice, you had to reject your children. And what does he say? He equates this to abortion, and the fact, and what he calls abortion is parents sacrificing their children on the altar of convenience. And I think that's exactly what's happening. I don't want to have this baby. I can't afford it. It takes too much time, whatever. Let's go have an abortion. It's about convenience. It's about what you want. And he says Baal worship in reality corresponds exactly to the activities that many people freely participate in today. And they do so without really understanding the nature of it. He goes on and talks about, and I'm trying to rush through this now because I've taken up way too much time. He says believers in Yahweh in the northern kingdom had to be conflicted. If you were a believer, you had to be conflicted. You couldn't agree with everything that was happening at these places of worship, but you also had a hard time giving them up because there was a lot of social aspect to this. So this brings up, and this is the last point I'll say regarding this article, is that when you have people, so there was a church built not far from our house up the street there, and they came to our door and they said, hey, we got a new church over here, new community church, and we just wanted to ask you, what would you like to see in a church? So what are they doing? They're creating a church around what you want, and what are people going to say? Oh, we want a program for our kids, maybe a youth group, and can we have a a singles club, that, maybe we can hang out with or stuff like that's what people want. That's what it revolves around. So,
When you told them Bible exposition?
yeah, I told them I want sound doctrine and Bible exposition. And they, okay, write it down, okay, all right. You might be outvoted on this, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. I expect nothing less. Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much patience for that kind of stuff. And I had a Jehovah's Witness come to our door one time. This was a while ago, and he started talking. I'm sorry, it was Mormon. He started talking about the Book of Mormon, and he says, well, I really want to give you this copy, which I took because I don't want him to give it to somebody else. And he said, I really want to give you this. And he goes, if you read it, you're going to find that, in your heart that these things must be true. And I said, oh, wow. I said, it's funny because Jeremiah says that the heart above all things is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? And he just like, well, what do you mean? I said, I'm not. I don't think I'll trust my heart in this matter. So anyway, that's the kind of patience I have. Some people are really good. They'll invite them in and get into a good theological discussion. I'm not that patient. You know what, you guys? Because I just really blew my time. I'm going to have you guys read this article on your own. I had things I wanted to highlight in here, but you guys will see the important parts as you come across it. But read that article on your own. That's your homework for next week. I think it's very worthwhile. And again, he wrote a whole book. You can buy it online. Just look up the title online under Peterson, and you can buy it. It's like $37. I haven't splurged for that one yet. So here's the other topic. I got 8 minutes to go through this topic, and I guess what I'll do here is kind of talk, and I won't talk too much about what Tom has already mentioned. I think I'll just we'll look at a few different verses and stuff like that. But I think for the sake of the record, and because chapter 3 is pertinent, that we have an understanding of what happened here with Israel. And so you have to ask the question, especially when you look at chapter 3, well, did God actually divorce Israel? If so, was he married? Like what was the deal here? And Tom showed a couple of verses showing the marital covenant. Here's another one here. Because he does describe himself as a husband to Israel on multiple occasions. And this is one here in Isaiah 54, verse 5 and 6. For your maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called. For the Lord has called you like a wife, forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected. Okay, so anyway, there are a lot of verses like that that we can look at. Now I condensed this one down, and see, did I condense this one down? No, not yet. Hang on, we're gonna skip a chunk of that. We're just going to look at the last few verses here in 1 Kings chapter 11, because a few things going on. You got to understand there is a separation between the northern and southern kingdoms. I don't want to get into the whole history of it, although I had planned on getting into some of that history tonight. But the basic facts is that Solomon sinned. What did Solomon do in his sin? Well, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and those wives and concubines brought their own gods with them into Israel. He assisted in helping them set up their places of worship in the high places, their Asherah poles, Baal worship became prevalent under Solomon of all kings. Okay? That division occurred because of Solomon's sin. And the Lord promised him that. So without getting into too much more detail, I just want to look at these verses. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him regarding this thing, that he was not to follow other gods. But he did not comply with what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, since you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will certainly tear the kingdom away from you and will give it to your servant. However, I will not do it in your days only for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it away from the hand of your son. And this is the important verse here. Yet I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give you one tribe for your son, to your son, for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. This is a really interesting statement here, because he's tearing away that kingdom from Solomon when his son comes on the throne. And when he tears it away, though, he preserves a portion of it. He preserves a remnant, which he was not going to tear away. Well, of course, that part that he tore away obviously ended up being the northern kingdom, and that northern kingdom was as unfaithful to the Lord as Solomon was, maybe even more so. And so, of course, in Hosea, we see that relationship being expressed in what God has Hosea doing there. But so he ends up divorcing, which I'm going to show you a little bit of that here in just a second. He ends up divorcing Israel, but not Judah. Okay, and Tom explained this as well, and I'm just sort of repeating it mostly for the video. But he divorces one, but not the other. Why did he not divorce the southern kingdom? Because they were just as bad. Okay, Tom had mentioned that. It wasn't on account that they were more godly, although you could make a case, well, that at least they had some godly kings in the south. Okay, and the north had no godly kings. They were all evil in God's eyes. But that's not the reason he preserves the south, because they were, in God's eyes, even just as wicked as the northern kingdom. But he kept them for what? For the sake of his servant David. The Lord had made a covenant with David, and that all ties back into the Abrahamic covenant, which includes the land promises. But specifically with David, it had to do with the king, that a king would be on the throne forever. And you can't have a king without the land. Now, was it fully fulfilled with David? Well, he had his posterity on the throne for a while, but then even that ceased, okay, when they were dispersed. And it never really regained, but it will in the future, okay? So I'm kind of jumping ahead here. And I think we saw these same verses with Tom, Jeremiah chapter 3. She saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, the northern kingdom, he's talking about here, I sent her away with a decree of divorce. I don't think you can really question the issue of divorce here. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear. Judah should have feared, seeing what God did to Israel, but Judah did not. But she too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. Yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. Does this sound like Judah was any better off than Israel? It doesn't. But God had made a promise, and this covenant with David and with Abraham before him was unconditional in nature, and God honors that covenant. Just want to look at a couple other verses in Jeremiah. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. If a man divorces his wife and he goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? So in other words, if someone goes and gets divorced, is he going to go back to his wife after she has married someone else? Well, no. That person, or here, in this case, it says, would not that land be greatly polluted? And the answer is absolutely yes. But what happens here? Well, it says, you have played the whore with many lovers. He's speaking to Israel. Yet you would return to me, declares the Lord. Okay? The answer to that is no. She won't return to the Lord. Neither will Hosea's wife return to him. But what happens? The opposite happens. It is Hosea who has to go and purchase back his wife, which we're going to see in chapter 3, and it's the Lord who goes back and purchases the nation of Israel, and that comes at the price of his son, and that redemption will take place back in that day. Now, I have Deuteronomy chapter 4 here, which talks about how a man who takes a wife, chapter 24, yeah. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce. Well, he is not allowed to remarry her. Okay, I'm summarize the rest of Deuteronomy chapter 24 there. He's not allowed to remarry on the basis of the law. But on what basis did the Lord remarry, so to speak, Israel? Was it on the basis of the law? Oh, the law has been done away with it. It's on the basis of his covenant with Israel. Okay. Jeremiah 3 again, there's so much there. The Lord, looking again in the future, says, return, faithless Israel. I will frown on you no longer, for I am faithful. I will not be angry forever. In verse 14, return, O faithless children, declares the Lord, for I am your master. I will take you, one from a city, one from a fountain, and I will bring you to Zion. So the Lord does not ultimately abandon her. And of course, how can this be accomplished? And it can't apart from the Lord. And I'm not going to get into this for the sake of time, but Romans chapter 11, Paul picks up on this whole thing. Has God rejected his people? Okay? And he says, by no means. He says, for I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And then he goes on talking about even their worship of Baal he includes in here. But with Elijah, he says, I have preserved a remnant, okay, who have not bowed their knee down to Baal. Okay, that's what the Lord did back in this time as well. He preserved a group which he did not divorce at that time. But that remnant, there's always a believing remnant. And then in verse 6, he summarizes it. This remnant chosen by grace. He says, but if it is by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Okay, grace versus the law. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Okay, Romans chapter 11, verse 11 and 23. I encourage you to read those as well. And then I'm going to stop there, and we will pick up in chapter 3. Now I'm really falling behind you guys. We'll pick up in chapter 3 next week. Luckily, it's only 5 verses.